Hey, so glad you got here. We were totally waiting for you, just about to listen to a story that drifts through misty hills, forgotten footpaths, and the kind of secret that only finds someone who isn't really looking for it. Tonight's tale follows a wandering bard whose greatest treasure isn't a golden coin or a jeweled crown, but a song that refuses to leave his heart. Along the way, there will be curious strangers, suspicious birds that seem to judge everyone equally, and at least one decision that looks wonderfully clever right up until it doesn't. That, as any traveler would tell you, is usually how the best adventures begin. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're here, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what the local time is where you are. It's always fascinating to imagine this story traveling farther than any wandering minstrel ever could. Now settle in, get comfortable, and just relax. Today's tale starts like this. There was once a man named Aldrin, a bard whose boots were older than many village elders and whose cloak carried enough patches to qualify as its own quilt. He traveled wherever roads were willing to go, and sometimes where roads had long ago surrendered to grass, roots, and stubborn rocks. Unlike knights, he owned no shining armor. Unlike merchants, he carried no chest overflowing with silver. His greatest possessions were a weathered lute, a pleasant voice, and an astonishing confidence that tomorrow's supper would somehow introduce itself before sunset. Remarkably, it often did. Some people believed fortune favored him. Others believed innkeepers simply felt sorry for him. Aldrin preferred not to investigate either explanation too closely. The spring air carried the scent of damp earth as he crossed rolling hills scattered with sheep that regarded him with the sort of deep suspicion usually reserved for tax collectors. One particularly determined ram stared so intensely that Aldrin gave it a respectful nod before continuing. The ram appeared satisfied, or perhaps disappointed that intimidation had worked so easily. Either way, peace was maintained. By midday, he reached a market village alive with chatter. Bakers argued cheerfully over whose bread smelled better. Blacksmiths hammered glowing iron into useful shapes, and children chased one another around carts with the endless energy granted only to youth. Aldrin found his usual place beneath an old oak tree. He tuned his lute, played a lively tune. Soon smiles appeared. Coins landed inside his cap. One elderly woman laughed so hard at one of his verses that she nearly dropped the goose she intended to purchase. Fortunately, the goose remained deeply professional throughout the incident. After several songs, a stooped old traveler approached. His beard looked as though it had spent several years negotiating independently with the wind. His walking staff leaned slightly, much like its owner. Instead of offering payment, the stranger offered conversation. "Your songs wander," the old man observed. "They've learned from experience," Aldrin replied. The stranger chuckled softly. "Good. Wandering songs. Sometimes find wandering truths." That sounded exactly like the sort of sentence old travelers enjoyed saying after reaching a certain age. Aldrin smiled politely anyway. What truth might that be? The man's eyes drifted toward distant hills, where forests darkened the horizon. "They say there's a fountain no map remembers." Aldrin raised an eyebrow. "Hidden treasure? No. Magic? A little. Immortality?" The old man laughed outright. No sensible person would ever build such a fountain. That answer somehow created even more questions. The traveler lowered his voice. "They say whoever drinks there hears the world differently." Aldrin tilted his head. "Differently how?" "The birds become historians. The rivers remember. The wind sings forgotten names." He paused. "And music changes forever." Now that captured a bard's attention. Gold disappeared, jewels were stolen, castles crumbled, but songs survived generations. Entire kingdoms vanished while old melodies continued drifting from one campfire to another. If a fountain truly existed that could reveal forgotten music, well, that was difficult to ignore. The old traveler finished adjusting his pack. Of course, he added, every marvelous story grows thorns eventually. Before Aldrin could ask another question, the stranger wandered away into the bustling crowd. By sunset, he had vanished completely. No one else seemed to know where he'd gone, or even remembered seeing him arrive. Aldrin spent the evening playing cheerful melodies inside the village square, yet the conversation refused to leave his thoughts. A fountain forgotten by maps, water that altered songs. Ridiculous, impossible, exactly the kind of rumor wandering musicians quietly treasured. Late that night, while sharing bread and cheese beside a small fire, outside the village, another traveler noticed Aldrin studying the northern hills. "You planning to head into those woods?" asked the newcomer. "Perhaps. They're unusually quiet. Quiet forests aren't uncommon. This one has been quiet for 50 years. Now that sounded considerably less comforting. The traveler explained that hunters often returned, describing an odd stillness beneath the trees. Not frightening, just different. Even birds seemed to pause before entering. Stranger still, people occasionally discovered ancient footpaths hidden beneath moss, paths that appeared on one visit and vanished on the next. Locals mostly avoided discussing it. Farmers had enough ordinary problems without inviting mysterious forests into conversation. A curious custom had developed over generations. Whenever someone journeyed toward those hills, neighbors gifted them a small sprig of rosemary. No one remembered why. Everyone continued doing it anyway. Old traditions often survive because forgetting them somehow feels riskier than understanding them. That was the eccentric thing about villages. Someone's great-grandmother began a habit centuries ago, and suddenly everyone accepts that vegetables taste better if harvested while wearing the same lucky hat. History is full of customs that began with perfectly reasonable explanations before wandering off somewhere without leaving directions. The next morning, an elderly baker handed Aldrin a fresh loaf. For the road. A shepherd offered dried apples. The blacksmith sharpened his eating knife free of charge. Finally, the same old woman who had nearly dropped her goose tucked a fragrant sprig of rosemary into his cloak. "For good fortune." "What does it do?" She smiled. "No idea." Then she walked away before he could ask another question. Helpful. Very helpful. Still, the small green herb carried a pleasant scent. Aldrin secured his loot across his back, tightened his boots, adjusted his patched cloak, and looked toward the distant forest, rising beyond the hills. He wasn't chasing riches, nor glory, not even adventure itself. He was following a story. Every bard understood that the finest tales were never found sitting comfortably beside warm fires. They waited beyond familiar roads, hiding inside old rumors whispered by strangers whose names were forgotten before sunrise. With one final glance at the village shrinking behind him, Aldrin stepped onto the narrow trail leading north. Above him, clouds drifted lazily across the morning sky. Ahead, the ancient woodland waited in complete silence, as though listening for the first note of a song that had not been heard in centuries. Morning unfolded slowly across the northern hills, wrapping the landscape in a cool silver mist that softened every stone and tree into gentle shapes. Aldrin followed the narrow trail with an easy rhythm, humming under his breath, more out of habit than intention. A bard who traveled in silence for too long usually found himself talking to bushes before noon, and bushes, despite appearances, rarely contributed much to a conversation. The path climbed steadily. Behind him, the village disappeared beneath folds of green hills, until only thin threads of chimney smoke remained visible against the brightening sky. Ahead, the forest waited. It did not tower menacingly. It did not seem cursed. If anything, It looked almost ordinary, and somehow that made it even stranger. The old traveler had spoken of silence. The shepherd had mentioned paths that wandered. The baker had simply wished him luck with an expression usually reserved for people attempting spectacularly questionable decisions. As Aldrin crossed the final meadow, he noticed something peculiar. The meadow itself was full of sound. Bees wandered lazily between wildflowers. Grasshoppers clicked invisibly among the tall grass. Larks sang somewhere overhead. But exactly where the forest began, the music stopped. Not gradually, not naturally. It was as though an invisible line had been drawn across the earth. One step farther, and the cheerful orchestra of the countryside simply ended. Aldrin paused with one boot resting on a moss-covered stone. He looked behind him. Birdsong. He looked ahead. Nothing. No chirping. No rustling wings. No distant woodpecker hammering at stubborn bark. Only stillness. He rubbed his chin. "I've played for quieter audiences," he murmured. The forest offered no opinion. He stepped forward. The moment he crossed beneath the first branches, the air changed. It felt cooler, not cold, just older. The scent of pine mingled with damp earth and ancient leaves that had spent generations becoming soft brown layers beneath the trees. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in long golden beams, illuminating tiny particles of dust that drifted lazily like forgotten memories. The trail remained surprisingly clear. Someone had walked here, perhaps many someones, yet no fresh footprints marked the earth, only faint depressions so worn by time they could have been decades old, or centuries. Aldrin adjusted the strap holding his lute. "Well," he said to himself, "if mysterious fountains are accepting visitors today, I'd hate to arrive looking nervous." He continued. Hours slipped quietly past. The forest revealed itself one careful detail at a time. Massive oaks twisted their branches into graceful arches. Towering pines stood like patient watchmen. Velvet moss covered fallen logs so completely they resembled emerald cushions. Once, Aldrin reached out to steady himself against what appeared to be a boulder. The boulder blinked. It turned out to be an exceptionally sleepy tortoise. Neither traveler seemed more surprised than the other. "I apologize," Aldrin said politely. The tortoise blinked again. Its expression suggested this sort of misunderstanding happened far too often. It resumed pretending to be geology. Aldrin moved on. Near midday, he discovered the first truly unusual sign. A weathered milestone leaned beside the trail. Its carved letters had almost vanished beneath moss, but enough remained to read a single word. North. He looked ahead. The trail curved east. He looked behind. It curved west. Neither direction pointed north. He circled the stone twice. Perhaps whoever carved it had possessed an imaginative understanding of geography. Or perhaps the forest had decided directions were merely suggestions. Neither explanation inspired complete confidence. Still, the old stories had warned that ordinary rules became rather flexible here. He walked on. Not long afterward, he found another oddity. A tiny wooden bridge crossed a narrow stream. The bridge appeared remarkably well built, despite being entirely covered in climbing ivy. No footprints crossed its planks. No sign suggested recent repairs. Yet the wood remained perfectly sound. At its center rested a single smooth white feather. No bird could be seen. No breeze disturbed it. The feather simply waited. Aldrin picked it up. It felt surprisingly warm. Then, almost immediately, a gentle wind slipped through the trees. The feather drifted from his fingers and floated downstream, disappearing around a bend. The breeze vanished just as quickly. "Interesting," Aldrin whispered. The silence returned. There are curious beliefs recorded in forgotten corners of medieval life that travelers often overlooked. Some claimed forests remembered every person who entered them. Others believed certain woods measured visitors not by strength or wealth, but by courtesy. Whether such tales held truth or not, people throughout many lands thought it wise to greet old trees before taking shelter beneath them. Aldrin had always found that custom rather charming. So when he stopped beneath a broad oak to eat his midday meal, he rested one hand lightly against its trunk. My thanks. Nothing happened. Of course nothing happened. Trees rarely applauded. Even so, the gesture felt appropriate. He shared his bread, dried apples, and cheese with complete satisfaction. The rosemary sprig remained tucked safely inside his cloak. Its fragrance seemed somehow stronger here. As afternoon approached, the trail narrowed until it almost vanished beneath thick roots. More than once, Aldrin lost sight of it entirely. Yet each time he hesitated, some small clue guided him forward. A bent fern, a cluster of pale mushrooms, a patch of sunlight resting precisely where he needed to step. The forest wasn't exactly showing him the way. It simply wasn't hiding it very well. Eventually he reached a clearing. At its center stood 7 standing stones arranged in a rough circle. Each stone carried ancient carvings almost erased by time. Swirls, stars, waves, birds, trees. One symbol appeared repeatedly, a flowing line that resembled water. He traced it gently with his fingertips. The stone felt unexpectedly smooth, almost polished, as though countless hands had touched that same carving over generations. In the middle of the circle lay nothing, no altar, no monument, only grass growing slightly greener than elsewhere. Aldrin sat quietly. Something about the place encouraged listening. Minutes passed. Still no birds sang, no insects buzzed. Even the leaves remained perfectly still. Then, so softly, he almost imagined it, came a single musical note, clear, pure, lasting only an instant. He stood. Another note answered from somewhere deeper within the woods. Then another. None belonged to birds. None resembled ordinary instruments. They floated through the trees like fragments of an unfinished melody. Aldrin followed, not quickly, carefully. The notes never repeated exactly. Each seemed to invite rather than command. Around fallen trunks, across tiny streams, between towering beeches whose pale bark glowed softly beneath afternoon light. The farther he walked, the stronger one sensation became. He no longer felt alone, not watched, not hunted, simply accompanied, as though the forest itself had decided to walk beside him without revealing its face. The feeling wasn't frightening. If anything, it carried a curious warmth, like sitting beside someone who preferred silence over conversation. Then he noticed fresh footprints, human, only one set. They appeared suddenly in damp earth before him, bare feet, small, perfectly clear. He knelt. The impressions pointed ahead. After perhaps 20 steps, they ended, not faded, ended. No return tracks, no leap, no disturbance, only the last footprint. Beyond it, untouched moss stretched beneath ancient trees. Aldrin remained still for a long moment. Finally, he smiled. I suppose that's one way to keep people guessing. He rose, adjusted his cloak, and continued toward the distant music, unaware that somewhere beyond the next ridge, hidden beneath centuries of roots and stone, the impossible fountain waited in perfect silence, as though it had been expecting one more wandering bard all along. The footprints vanished, but the melody did not. It lingered ahead, never loud enough to reveal its source, never faint enough to disappear entirely. Aldrin followed at an unhurried pace, allowing the music to guide him. The way sailors trusted stars hidden behind thin clouds, the forest slowly changed around him. The towering oaks gave way to slender beeches, whose silver trunks caught the afternoon light like polished bone. Ferns grew taller here, brushing gently against his boots. Moss spread across every fallen branch until even broken logs seemed softened by time. Still, there were no birds. No squirrels darted between branches. No buzzing insects circled the wildflowers. It was not the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of waiting. Aldrin had performed before kings who held entire halls, breathless while deciding whether they enjoyed a song. The forest reminded him of that same moment. Everything listening, nothing interrupting. He rounded another bend and found something that made him stop. A stone arch. No walls connected to it. No ruined castle surrounded it. It simply stood alone between two ancient yew trees. Gray blocks fitted together with remarkable precision, despite carrying centuries of moss and climbing ivy. Across the top, almost hidden beneath lichen, someone had carved flowing letters in a language Aldrin did not recognize. He stepped beneath the arch. Nothing happened. He stepped backward. Still nothing. Well, he sighed, at least you're consistent. The arch maintained its mysterious dignity. Not every ancient monument felt obligated to impress passing bards. Beyond it, the trail widened unexpectedly. The earth became smoother. Roots no longer crossed the path. It almost resembled a road that had slept beneath the forest for generations. As he walked, he began noticing small piles of smooth white stones placed beside the trail. 3 stones, then 5, then 7. Each stack stood perfectly balanced. Not one had fallen. Someone had built them. But how long ago? The moss covering the lower stones suggested many years, perhaps longer. Aldrin resisted the temptation to rearrange one. Old places appreciated good manners. Besides, every traveler knew that interfering with mysterious landmarks rarely improved one's afternoon. His stomach reminded him that adventure did little to replace lunch. He reached into his satchel for the remaining piece of bread. At that exact moment, a plump squirrel appeared on a nearby stump. It stared directly at the bread, then at Aldrin, then back at the bread. "You've arrived rather late," Aldrin observed. The squirrel blinked. "I've already been walking since sunrise." The squirrel remained entirely unconcerned by this information. Its expression clearly suggested that all schedules should revolve around available food. Aldrin laughed softly and broke off a tiny piece. The squirrel accepted the offering with astonishing dignity before vanishing into the undergrowth. "So much ceremony," Aldrin muttered. "You'd think I had knighted him." His own laughter sounded strangely bright inside the quiet woods. It faded quickly, but for just an instant, the forest almost seemed pleased. The mysterious melody returned. This time it was clearer. Not one voice, many. Soft harmonies, weaving together like threads in an enormous tapestry. No words accompanied them, only notes. Beautiful, ancient, impossible to remember once they faded. Aldrin tried humming the tune. He managed perhaps 4 notes. The 5th escaped him completely. The melody slipped away like water through open fingers. He frowned. That had never happened before. His memory for music bordered on uncanny. Entire ballads could remain with him after hearing them only once. Yet this refused to stay. The realization filled him with equal measures of frustration and fascination. He walked faster. The path began descending. The air grew cooler. He smelled fresh water long before he heard it. Not the rush of a river, not the splash of a waterfall. Something quieter, gentler. A patient trickling that echoed faintly among hidden stones. The trees gradually spread apart. Sunlight brightened. Then, quite suddenly, the forest ended. Before him stretched a secluded valley unlike anything he had ever imagined. High cliffs surrounded it on every side, their rocky faces draped with ivy and flowering vines. Great ash trees stood around the edges, their branches forming a living circle that sheltered the valley from the outside world. Wildflowers covered the grass in gentle waves of blue, white, and pale gold. Butterflies floated lazily above them. Curiously, these were the first living creatures besides the squirrel that he had seen since entering the woods. The silence here felt different, peaceful rather than expectant. At the valley's center rested a pool no larger than a village square. Its surface was perfectly still, not frozen, simply untouched. From the middle of the pool rose an elegant stone fountain. It was not grand, no towering statues, no jeweled decorations. Its beauty came from remarkable simplicity. A single circular basin supported a graceful column carved with winding vines, stars, birds, and flowing water. At the top rested a smooth stone bowl from which crystal-clear water spilled in 4 delicate streams. The water caught the afternoon sun. It shimmered, not like ordinary reflections, more like tiny fragments of dawn itself, drifting endlessly through the falling drops. Aldrin stood motionless. "So," he whispered, "you actually exist." The fountain answered with the quiet sound of flowing water. Nothing more. No magical glow burst across the valley. No heavenly choir appeared. No mysterious voice declared ancient prophecies. It simply continued flowing exactly as it always had. Oddly enough, that made the moment feel even more extraordinary. Magic rarely announced itself. The finest stories often began with things behaving as though they had nothing to prove. He approached slowly. Each step seemed to soften the noise inside his own thoughts. Old worries faded. The memory of sore feet drifted away. Even hunger became distant. Only calm remained. Near the fountain's edge, he noticed carvings circling the stone basin. Unlike those upon the arch, these were written in familiar letters. Time had worn many away. Only fragments survived. Drink. Remember. Gift. Listen. The remaining words had disappeared beneath centuries of weather. Aldrin rested one hand upon the cool stone. The craftsmanship amazed him. There were no visible tool marks, no cracks, no repairs. It was as though the fountain had emerged whole from the earth. An old medieval belief claimed that certain springs were guarded not by monsters, but by memory itself. Pilgrims sometimes tied ribbons or left carved tokens beside sacred wells, believing the water carried wishes farther than spoken prayers ever could. Here, however, there were no offerings, no ribbons, no coins, nothing. Either no one had found the place, or everyone who had understood that nothing should be left behind. The water itself fascinated him, perfectly clear. He could see every pebble resting beneath the shallow basin, yet every so often, faint silver ripples crossed the surface without any visible cause. Not wind, not falling leaves. Just gentle circles, expanding outward before disappearing completely. He crouched. The scent rising from the fountain surprised him. Not merely fresh water. It carried hints of rain, crushed mint, distant pine forests, and something impossible to name. Like remembering a place from childhood without recalling where it had been. His own reflection looked back from the surface. For just an instant, he thought he saw someone standing beside him. He turned. No one. When he looked back, only his own face remained. A breeze stirred the valley for the first time. The flowers swayed gently. Far overhead, a single white cloud drifted across the sun. The light shifted. Tiny rainbows appeared within the falling streams. Aldrin extended one hand beneath the flowing water. It felt cool, not icy, wonderfully refreshing. Droplets slipped through his fingers with remarkable softness. He hesitated. Every sensible lesson learned across years of wandering advised against drinking from mysterious enchanted fountains discovered in forgotten valleys. Unfortunately, curiosity had always been considerably louder than common sense. He smiled to himself. "I suppose," he murmured, "one sip can't possibly rewrite the whole world." With that, he cupped the crystal water carefully in both hands and slowly lifted it toward his lips. Aldrin held the water for a moment before drinking. It rested in his cupped hands, as clearly as polished crystal, reflecting fragments of sky, drifting clouds, and the curious face of a bard who had spent most of his life chasing stories instead of sensible occupations. He smiled. "Well," he whispered to the silent valley, "if this turns me into a frog, I hope it's at least a musical frog." The fountain offered no warning. No thunder rolled across the cliffs. No mysterious figure emerged from behind the ash trees shouting, "Stop! There was a very important instruction carved on the other side." The water simply waited. So Aldrin drank. The first sip was astonishingly ordinary. Cool, fresh, cleaner than any mountain spring he had ever tasted. For one brief heartbeat, disappointment almost crept into his thoughts. Had he crossed half a wilderness for exceptionally good water? Then the sensation changed. Not suddenly, gradually. Like the first warmth of sunrise reaching a valley long before the sun itself becomes visible. The coolness spread through him with remarkable gentleness. His tired feet no longer ached. The stiffness in his shoulders eased. Even the scratches earned from stubborn branches seemed less noticeable. He exhaled slowly. Every breath felt deeper than the last. The air itself tasted richer somehow. He could distinguish the fragrance of moss from damp bark, wild mint growing near the rocks, the sweetness of distant flowers carried upon the faintest breeze. He blinked. The colors around him seemed clearer, not brighter, simply more complete. Each blade of grass possessed subtle shades of green he could not remember noticing before. The gray stone of the fountain contained hints of blue and silver hidden within its weathered surface. A butterfly settled upon a white flower nearby. Its wings carried patterns, so delicate they resembled tiny painted windows. Had they always looked like that? Or had he simply never paid enough attention? Aldrin laughed quietly. "If this is magic," he admitted, "it's considerably more polite than expected." He sat beside the fountain. Nothing extraordinary happened. No glowing symbols appeared across his arms. His hair did not suddenly turn golden. He felt no overwhelming surge of power. Instead, a profound calm settled over him. The sort of peace usually found only after finishing a difficult journey and realizing there was nowhere else you needed to be. Minutes slipped past unnoticed. The gentle trickle of falling water became strangely captivating. Each stream produced a slightly different tone. Together, they formed soft harmonies barely noticeable unless one truly listened. Without thinking, Aldrin reached for his lute. His fingers rested upon the strings. He played a single note. It blended perfectly with the fountain. Then another, then another. Soon a quiet melody unfolded. Not one he had learned, not one he consciously composed. It simply arrived. His hands moved effortlessly. The tune wandered gently through the peaceful valley, weaving itself between the sounds of falling water. When the final note faded, Aldrin stared at his own instrument. "I don't know that song." Yet somehow, he did. He could play it again immediately. Every note remained clear within his memory. Where had it come from? The fountain continued flowing without explanation. As though borrowing forgotten music happened every day, he tried another melody. This time won. He had performed countless times in village squares. It emerged differently, richer. Small flourishes appeared beneath his fingers, that had never existed before. The familiar tune carried hidden echoes, as though an invisible musician quietly accompanied him, not correcting him, simply reminding him of possibilities he had overlooked. He lowered the lute slowly. No audience had ever applauded with greater silence. A curious thought crossed his mind. He closed his eyes, listened. At first he heard only water, then something else. Leaves shifting high above, tiny roots drinking beneath the earth, faraway stones settling almost imperceptibly against one another. Sounds too soft for ordinary hearing. The entire valley breathed, not literally. Yet everything possessed its own quiet rhythm, each part belonging naturally to the whole. Aldrin opened his eyes again. "This place sings," he murmured. A breeze answered by stirring the branches overhead. One leaf spiraled downward. It landed upon the fountain. Instead of floating away, it rested upon the surface without sinking. The water flowed beneath it, while the leaf remained perfectly still. After several heartbeats, it lifted gently into the air once more. No wind touched it. It simply drifted toward the grass before settling peacefully among the flowers. Aldrin watched in fascinated silence. There were old tales in medieval monasteries about springs believed to sharpen not the eyes, but the soul. Some scholars wrote that wisdom could not be poured into a person like wine into a cup. Instead, sacred places merely removed distractions, allowing people to notice truths that had always been quietly present. Whether those scholars were correct, Aldrin could not have said. But sitting beside the fountain, the idea suddenly felt remarkably reasonable. Time became difficult to measure. The sun moved slowly across the opening above the valley. Shadows lengthened, yet Aldrin never felt impatient. For perhaps the first time in years, he experienced no urge to hurry toward the next town, the next performance, or the next warm meal. He simply existed. A dragonfly skimmed across the pool. Its wings shimmered like polished glass. For the briefest instant, Aldrin could almost imagine hearing the faint hum they produced, not merely a buzz, a precise musical tone. He chuckled. "Either you're remarkably talented." The dragonfly continued its graceful flight, "or I'm becoming wonderfully strange." The insect offered no clarification, probably for the best. Conversations with dragonflies tended to be rather one-sided. Eventually he stood. The calm remained with him. His movements felt lighter, his thoughts clearer, not faster, simply less cluttered. He walked once around the fountain, studying every carved line along its weathered stone. Near the back, almost hidden beneath creeping ivy, he noticed another inscription. Most had eroded beyond recognition. Only a handful of words survived. "Here, before speaking. Remember. Forget." The final line had disappeared entirely. He brushed away a little moss. Nothing more emerged. Whatever message had once been carved there belonged mostly to time now. He rested his hand against the ancient stone once again. The surface felt slightly warmer than before, or perhaps his imagination had grown unusually active. Either seemed possible. As evening approached, golden sunlight spilled across the valley. The water reflected the changing sky until the entire fountain appeared filled with liquid amber. Beautiful, peaceful, timeless. Then, a voice began singing, soft, clear, not from behind him, not across the valley. It seemed to come from everywhere at once. No words, only a melody, ancient beyond memory. Aldrin slowly turned in a complete circle. No one stood among the flowers. No traveler approached along the hidden path. The song continued, gentle, patient, almost inviting. He listened with complete attention. The melody stirred something deep within him. Not a memory exactly. More like the feeling that a forgotten memory stood just beyond reach, waiting for the proper key to unlock it. His heart beat a little faster. Then, without conscious thought, he began humming along. To his astonishment, he somehow knew the next notes before they arrived. The unseen singer and the wandering bard moved together in perfect harmony. The valley seemed to brighten. The fountain's waters shimmered more intensely than before. Tiny ripples crossed the perfectly still basin. And somewhere, just beyond the circle of ancient ash trees, someone or something listened with quiet approval. The unseen song faded as gently as evening light, slipping behind distant hills. For several long moments, Aldrin remained exactly where he stood, his hands resting lightly against the worn body of his lute. The last note seemed unwilling to disappear completely. It lingered somewhere between memory and silence, like the faint scent of rain after the clouds have already drifted away. He tried to hum it again. The opening phrase came easily. The next few notes followed. Then the melody turned unexpectedly, not incorrectly, simply, somewhere he had not anticipated. He stopped, laughed quietly. I've just been outperformed by invisible company. The valley, as usual, declined to boast about the achievement. Aldrin sat once more beside the fountain. The calm he had felt since drinking remained, but now something else had joined it. Curiosity, not the restless curiosity that sent travelers climbing dangerous cliffs merely because someone had said, "I wonder what's up there." No, this felt deeper, as though his own thoughts had become larger rooms than before. Questions wandered through them comfortably instead of rushing toward answers. He closed his eyes. The water continued flowing. Its rhythm no longer sounded random. Each stream possessed its own gentle pattern. Together they formed a delicate harmony that repeated without ever becoming identical. Like breathing, like waves upon a distant shore, like stories told by grandparents who insisted each telling was exactly the same, despite somehow adding an entirely new goose every single time. Memory, Aldrin reflected, had always been a creative profession. As the thought crossed his mind, another sound emerged. Not from the fountain, not from the forest, from somewhere inside himself. A single line of music, perfectly clear. He frowned. He had never composed that melody. Yet it arrived complete, as though someone had carefully placed it upon an empty table inside his mind. He reached immediately for the lute. His fingers found the notes effortlessly. The tune unfolded with remarkable grace. It was gentle at first, then unexpectedly joyful, carrying a warmth that reminded him of summer evenings in villages where strangers became friends simply by sharing bread around a fire. When he finished, another melody appeared. Then another, not crowding, not competing, simply waiting, patiently, like travelers forming an orderly queue. Aldrin blinked. This is new. He played again. Each piece differed completely from the last. One danced lightly, like children chasing butterflies through meadows. Another carried the solemn dignity of monks walking beneath candlelight. A third sounded almost playful enough to convince even the grumpiest stable horse that life might occasionally deserve optimism. That would have been a truly miraculous composition. Stable horses generally regarded happiness as suspicious. Hours passed unnoticed. Music continued arriving, not endlessly, not overwhelmingly. Just enough that every quiet pause seemed to invite another forgotten tune into the light. There were old traditions among wandering musicians that claimed songs were never truly invented. Bards often believed melodies drifted through the world like invisible birds, occasionally choosing someone willing to listen carefully enough. Most treated the idea as charming poetry rather than literal truth. Sitting beside the fountain, Aldrin wasn't entirely certain anymore. He experimented. Instead of playing, he simply listened. A breeze crossed the valley. Within it, He thought he detected faint harmonies. Leaves brushed gently together overhead. They formed soft rhythms. Water struck stone. Different notes answered, depending on where each droplet landed. Even his own breathing seemed to belong naturally within an enormous composition stretching far beyond the valley itself. Then came voices, not speaking, singing, very quietly. He looked around. Still no one. The voices remained distant, layered one atop another. Men, women, children, old, young, some bright, some deep, all woven together into melodies unlike anything performed in courts or marketplaces. The songs carried no recognizable language, yet somehow he understood them, not word for word, feeling for feeling. One melody spoke of long journeys ending at home. Another carried the quiet sorrow of autumn leaves surrendering to winter. Another celebrated harvests, laughter, and shared tables beneath open skies. No translation was necessary. Emotion itself became the language. Aldrin felt tears gathering unexpectedly, not from sadness, from recognition. As though these songs had always existed somewhere beyond hearing, patiently awaiting the moment someone finally noticed them. He wiped one eye and laughed softly. Well, this is becoming difficult to explain. Fortunately, there was no audience demanding sensible explanations. The sun dipped lower. Golden light spread across the fountain. Every droplet glittered like tiny stars beginning their evening duties early. Aldrin noticed something new. Whenever he played one of the mysterious melodies, faint ripples appeared across the basin. Not large, just gentle circles spreading outward. Curiously, they matched the rhythm of whichever tune he performed. The fountain was listening, or answering. He couldn't tell which. Perhaps both. He cautiously tried one of his oldest performance songs, a lively tavern favorite, guaranteed to encourage dancing after sufficient mugs of ale. The ripples appeared, but weaker, smaller. The fountain seemed polite about it, appreciative, yet somehow less interested. He switched back to one of the unfamiliar melodies. Immediately, the water shimmered more brightly. The ripples deepened. Tiny flashes of silver moved beneath the surface. Aldrin leaned closer. At first, he assumed sunlight reflected strangely through the pool. Then he realized the flashes possessed shape. Not fish. Not leaves. Images. Brief. Fleeting. Gone before he could fully grasp them. He caught glimpses. An elderly woman singing while spinning wool. A child laughing beside a stream. Pilgrims climbing snowy mountain paths. A king removing his crown before kneeling beside a simple grave. Each vision lasted only an instant before dissolving into clear water once again. His heartbeat quickened. The fountain was not merely producing music, it remembered. He reached toward the surface. The images vanished immediately. Only gentle ripples remained. Perhaps they required listening rather than touching. So he waited, patiently. Another melody drifted into his thoughts. Slower this time. Melancholy without despair. He played. The water answered. This time the vision lingered slightly longer. He saw a young woman seated beneath a willow tree centuries ago. She held an instrument unlike any Aldrin recognized. Around her sat dozens of listeners. No grand hall, no palace, just ordinary people, farmers, children, travelers. She smiled as she sang. Everyone listened with complete attention. Then the image dissolved. Aldrin lowered the lute. I don't know you. Yet somehow he missed her, already. Another vision followed. An old shepherd teaching melodies to his grandson. A sailor singing alone beneath unfamiliar stars. Monks copying musical symbols onto fresh parchment by candlelight. None remained longer than a heartbeat. Each carried quiet dignity, lives remembered, songs preserved, forgotten by history, not forgotten here. A curious medieval belief held that memory could cling to places just as fragrance lingered upon cloth. Certain wells, bridges, and ancient trees were thought to absorb moments of great joy or sorrow, offering faint echoes to those willing to linger long enough. Most scholars dismissed such ideas. Standing beside the fountain, dismissal seemed increasingly ambitious. Twilight settled gently over the valley. The first evening stars appeared overhead. The fountain's waters reflected them perfectly, or perhaps not perfectly. Aldrin counted. 7 stars shone above. 8 shimmered below. He blinked, counted again. Still 8. The extra point of light rested deep within the basin itself. Not reflected, present. It pulsed softly, once, then faded. The valley grew still again. For the first time since arriving, Aldrin sensed that he was no longer merely discovering the fountain. The fountain had begun discovering him. Somewhere beyond the surrounding ash trees, hidden within gathering dusk, a quiet presence stirred, listening not only to the songs he played, but to the choices he had yet to make. Twilight settled over the hidden valley with remarkable patience. The sky deepened from gold to lavender, then from lavender to the rich blue that arrives just before the first true night. The fountain continued its endless song, its gentle streams catching the last light, until each falling drop resembled a tiny thread of silver. Aldrin remained seated beside the ancient basin. He no longer felt like a visitor. Not quite. More like someone who had been invited to wait. The strange sensation lingered only a moment before another sound reached him. Footsteps. Light. Measured. Not trying to hide. They came from somewhere beyond the ring of ash trees. Aldrin stood slowly, his hand resting on the neck of his lute, more from habit than caution. The footsteps stopped. Silence returned. Then a voice spoke. You listened before asking questions. It was calm, neither young nor old, neither distinctly male nor female, simply steady. A figure emerged between the trees. The traveler wore a long gray cloak that seemed almost woven from the evening mist itself. Their hair, silver white, despite an ageless face, rested loosely upon their shoulders. No jewelry gleamed in the fading light. No weapon hung at their side. Only a simple wooden staff accompanied them. They walked toward the fountain without hurry. The butterflies that had danced across the valley earlier now rested quietly among the flowers. Even the breeze seemed reluctant to interrupt. Aldrin offered a respectful nod. I was beginning to wonder if someone lived here. The stranger smiled faintly. Wondering is healthier than assuming. That's fair. They stopped beside the fountain and rested one hand upon the ancient stone, exactly where Aldrin himself had done countless times that day. You drank. I did. You asked permission. I suppose I did. You asked the valley. Aldrin blinked. I wasn't certain anyone else was listening. The valley was. The answer arrived so naturally that it felt almost obvious. The stranger looked toward the quiet water. It appreciates courtesy. For a few moments, neither spoke. The silence never became uncomfortable. It simply existed. Eventually, Aldrin cleared his throat. I've heard songs. I know. I've seen memories. I know. I've played melodies I've never learned. I know. There was something faintly amusing about having every astonishing discovery answered with the same gentle certainty. You already know quite a lot. The stranger chuckled. I have been here a long time. How long? The smile widened ever so slightly. Long enough to stop counting winters. That answered remarkably little. Yet Aldrin somehow sensed it was the truest response possible. The stranger turned toward him. My name is not important. Most people disagree. Most people spend much of life introducing themselves. And you don't? I introduced the fountain. Aldrin looked back at the flowing water. So this place belongs to you? The answer came immediately. No. You protect it? No. You guard it? No. Aldrin frowned. What do you do? I remain. Somehow that felt like the most accurate description imaginable. The stranger did not possess the air of an owner, nor a jailer, nor even a caretaker. They simply belonged here, the way old mountains belonged beneath clouds, the way rivers belonged to valleys, without needing explanation. You've been waiting, Aldrin observed. Yes. For me? For someone. The stranger's eyes reflected the fountain's gentle light. It happened to be you. A cool evening breeze wandered through the flowers. The scent of rosemary drifted faintly from Aldrin's cloak. The stranger noticed it immediately. A thoughtful village. They gave it to everyone traveling this way. They remembered. Remembered what? The stranger touched one of the fragrant leaves. They no longer know. Aldrin smiled. I suspected as much. There was a time when travelers left rosemary here. Why? Because remembrance deserves gratitude. The words settled gently between them. Aldrin glanced once more at the water. What exactly is this fountain? The stranger considered the question carefully. Finally they answered. It is a place that refuses to forget. The simple sentence somehow carried enormous weight. The songs, they remain. The memories, they remain. The people. A shadow crossed the stranger's expression. They do not. The fountain continued flowing softly. Aldrin felt another question forming. If it remembers everything, not everything. The correction came kindly. Only what is freely given. That puzzled him. I don't understand. You offered attention. I listened. So the fountain answered. I drank. You accepted its invitation. The stranger rested both hands lightly upon the worn stone. It never forces. That detail mattered, more than Aldrin first realized. Old legends usually involved enchantments, traps, or bargains hidden beneath clever wording. Nothing here felt deceptive. Every step had been his own, every choice entirely voluntary. The stranger looked toward him again. Tell me. What did you hear first? Aldrin thought. The water. And beneath it? He closed his eyes briefly. The valley breathing. The stranger nodded approvingly. And beneath that? The songs. A longer silence followed. Finally the stranger smiled. Good. Good? You listened in the proper order. Aldrin laughed. I wasn't aware there was an examination. There isn't. Another pause. But many fail. That answer lingered. There were curious medieval writings describing certain hermits who believed wisdom could only be approached indirectly. According to a handful of forgotten manuscripts, those who chased revelation found confusion, while those who practiced quiet attention sometimes discovered understanding, waiting patiently beside ordinary things. Whether such stories inspired this valley or merely echoed it, Aldrin could not tell. The resemblance felt undeniable. He sat once more upon the grass. The stranger remained standing beside the fountain. May I ask something else? You may. Will you answer? Perhaps. Comforting. The stranger laughed softly. It was the first truly carefree sound Aldrin had heard from them. You carry many songs already. I've spent years collecting them and giving them away. I suppose that's what songs are for. The stranger inclined their head. Exactly. Aldrin frowned slightly. Is that why the fountain showed them to me? The fountain noticed. Noticed what? That you keep music moving. The breeze stirred again. High above, evening stars multiplied across the deepening sky. The fountain reflected everyone. The water does not admire possession, the stranger continued. It admires sharing. Aldrin rested his lute across his knees. Then why hide all this? The stranger looked toward the surrounding cliffs. It isn't hidden. Aldrin raised an eyebrow. I spent nearly 2 days finding it. It waits. That sounds suspiciously similar. Only to impatient people. Aldrin could not argue. The path had never truly resisted him. It had simply required attention. The stranger's expression slowly grew more serious. There is something else. I suspected there might be. The fountain gives generously. I've noticed. It also asks. Aldrin felt the peaceful evening shift almost imperceptibly. What does it ask? Nothing immediately. That sounds encouraging. It waits until receiving becomes easier than giving. The words settled heavily. Aldrin looked down at the clear water. It asks for payment? No. A bargain? No. Then what? The stranger's gaze remained fixed upon the quiet basin. It asks whether you still remember why you came. Aldrin opened his mouth, closed it again. He had arrived searching for forgotten songs. Already he had found more than he believed possible. Yet now, he wasn't entirely certain what he wanted. The stranger seemed to notice the uncertainty. That question becomes more difficult with each passing day. A single leaf drifted onto the fountain. It circled slowly before floating away. The greatest danger, the stranger said gently, is not drinking too much. Aldrin waited. It is forgetting to leave. The valley fell silent once more. Somewhere in the distance, faint voices began singing again. Not as an invitation, this time, as a reminder. And for the first time since discovering the secret fountain, Aldrin realized that every blessing, no matter how beautiful, cast a shadow that could only be seen by those willing to look for it. Night settled fully over the hidden valley. Moonlight poured gently between the surrounding cliffs, bathing the flowers in pale silver and turning the fountain into a quiet pillar of shimmering light. The water no longer reflected the stars alone. It seemed to gather them, holding each tiny point of light upon its surface before releasing it again into the darkness. Aldrin sat quietly, replaying the stranger's final words. The greatest danger is not drinking too much. It is forgetting to leave. They were simple words, yet they lingered more stubbornly than any melody. The stranger had moved only a short distance away, settling beneath one of the ancient ash trees with the calm ease of someone who had watched countless nights unfold in exactly this place. Neither of them seemed eager to fill the silence. Eventually, Aldrin broke it. Has anyone ever forgotten? The stranger looked toward the fountain before answering. Many. Aldrin frowned. They stayed? They intended to leave. What changed? The stranger smiled sadly. They always believed tomorrow would be the better day. Tomorrow. Such an ordinary word. Yet travelers knew how deceptive it could become. Tomorrow the weather would improve. Tomorrow. The road would be easier. Tomorrow there would be enough time. Sometimes tomorrow quietly became years. The fountain trickled softly beside them. It never chains anyone, the stranger continued. It simply becomes difficult to imagine walking away. Aldrin rested his chin upon his folded hands. I can almost understand that. You've only been here 1 day. That observation carried more weight than its few words suggested. The bard looked toward the water again. Already the valley felt strangely familiar. Already the ordinary world beyond the forest seemed distant. The realization unsettled him just enough to notice it. The stranger rose slowly. "Come." They began walking along the edge of the pool. Aldrin followed. The path circled behind the fountain, where thick ivy climbed the surrounding rocks. Moonlight reached this side only in scattered patches. Hidden among the vines stood several weathered stone markers. Not graves, not exactly. Each was little more than a waist-high pillar, carved with the same flowing symbol Aldrin had seen earlier upon the standing stones in the forest. Water, memory, movement. The carvings had softened beneath centuries of rain. He counted them. 1, 3, 5, 9, 12 altogether, each different, each worn by time. "What are these?" The stranger rested a hand upon the nearest marker. "Remembrances. For the people who stayed." A gentle nod. "They eventually left." Aldrin blinked. "I thought you said they forgot." "They forgot for a while." The answer came with quiet kindness. "No one remains forever." He stepped closer to the nearest stone. Its surface carried a few surviving words. She taught laughter to lonely roads. Nothing else. No name, no dates. Only that single sentence. The next marker read, "He carried every sunrise inside one song." Another, "She listened before speaking." Another, "He shared bread with strangers without counting the cost." Aldrin moved slowly from stone to stone. None recorded battles, titles, wealth, or noble bloodlines. Instead, every inscription remembered something small, something human, a kindness, a habit, a quiet gift. "They're beautiful," Aldrin whispered. "They are true." The stranger smiled. "The fountain remembers what mattered most." Aldrin stood before the final marker. Unlike the others, it remained blank, perfectly smooth, untouched. He glanced toward the stranger. They offered no explanation. Perhaps none was needed. A cool breeze wandered through the valley. The fountain's gentle music continued without pause. Then Aldrin noticed something else. Near the base of several stones lay simple objects. A carved wooden whistle, a cracked clay cup, a smooth river pebble etched with tiny birds, a worn leather pouch. Nothing expensive, nothing grand, only ordinary possessions. They left these? They chose to. Why? Because they no longer needed reminders. Aldrin thought about the patched cloak folded around his shoulders, his old lute, the worn boots that had crossed countless roads. Travelers filled their lives with keepsakes, not because the objects possessed magic, because memories often preferred something solid to cling to. The stranger continued walking. Behind the stone markers, the cliffs opened into a narrow passage, almost hidden by hanging vines. Without speaking, they stepped inside. Aldrin hesitated only briefly before following. The passage twisted gently through cool stone. The air smelled faintly of minerals and damp earth. Drops of water echoed somewhere ahead. After several minutes, the corridor widened into a natural cavern. Moonlight filtered through narrow cracks high above, illuminating walls covered with ancient drawings, not paintings, carvings, thousands of them. Lines scratched patiently into the stone across generations. Some depicted flowing rivers. Others showed musicians seated beneath trees, travelers walking winding roads, families gathered around fires, children dancing, ships crossing restless seas. Everyday moments. Extraordinary, only because someone had cared enough to preserve them. Aldrin stepped closer. The craftsmanship varied greatly. Some carvings displayed remarkable skill. Others looked as though enthusiastic children had insisted upon contributing. One particularly determined attempt at depicting a horse resembled a rather confident potato. He smiled. "I hope the horse never saw that." The stranger followed his gaze. It probably approved. "You think so?" Horses rarely criticize art. That's refreshingly generous. The cavern seemed almost to approve the small joke. Its echoes softened into silence. "There is an old belief," the stranger said. "That memory belongs only to great kingdoms." "They're mistaken." "Very." They gestured toward the walls. "Most lives are quiet." Aldrin nodded slowly. "So these are ordinary people." "There are no ordinary people." The correction came gently. "Only ordinary moments." He let those words settle. They felt important. One carving caught his attention more than the others. It showed a young bard carrying a lute remarkably similar to his own. The figure stood beside the fountain while birds circled overhead. Unlike every other carving, this one remained unfinished. Only half the musician had been completed. The face was blank, the hands barely outlined. Aldrin frowned. Who was he? The stranger looked for a long moment before answering. He hadn't decided yet. What happened? He left. The carving stayed unfinished? Yes. Why? The stranger rested their fingers lightly upon the cool stone. Because not every story reaches its ending here. Aldrin found unexpected comfort in that. The fountain remembered, but it did not demand conclusions. Outside the cavern, an owl called once. The first bird song. He had heard since entering the forest. Soft, distant, real. He smiled instinctively. The birds are returning. They never truly left. Aldrin tilted his head. I haven't heard one since yesterday. You weren't listening for birds anymore. The realization struck him with surprising force. He had become so fascinated by the fountain's songs that ordinary sounds had quietly faded into the background. Exactly as the stranger had warned. Receiving had begun replacing noticing. The thought lingered as they walked slowly back toward the moonlit valley. When they emerged, the fountain shimmered peacefully beneath the stars, unchanged and endlessly patient. Aldrin looked first at the water, then at the flowers, then at the quiet ash trees. Finally, he listened, beyond the fountain's music, beyond the gentle breeze. There it was, a cricket singing somewhere among the grass, an owl gliding through distant branches, leaves whispering softly together. The ordinary world had been there all along. He had simply forgotten to hear it. And as that understanding settled gently into his heart, he realized the fountain's greatest lesson might never have been about forgotten songs at all. The cricket continued its tiny evening concert. Its song was simple, just a handful of notes repeated with patient determination. Nothing mysterious, nothing enchanted. Yet after hours spent listening to melodies older than kingdoms, Aldrin found himself smiling at the little creature's uncomplicated performance. It has excellent timing, he said quietly. The stranger inclined their head. It never worries about being remembered. Somehow, that sounded like wisdom. The moon climbed higher above the valley, casting pale ribbons of light across the flowers. A gentle mist began forming over the pool, thin enough that the fountain remained clearly visible, yet soft enough to blur the edges of the world into something almost dreamlike. Aldrin looked toward the dark forest beyond the cliffs. I should probably leave tomorrow. The words surprised him, not because they were untrue, because saying them aloud felt unexpectedly difficult. The stranger watched the fountain. You already sound uncertain. I noticed. That is how it begins. The bard laughed softly. I've barely arrived. So had everyone else. There was no accusation in the reply, only observation. Aldrin wrapped his cloak more tightly around his shoulders. The night air carried a pleasant chill now. I'd like to understand one thing. You may ask. The memories I saw. The people in the water. Were they real? They were. And they all found this place? Some did. The others? The stranger looked toward the still basin. The fountain remembers songs that pass through the world. Aldrin frowned thoughtfully. So not everyone drank here. No. Then why remember them? Because they gave freely. The answer arrived as naturally as water flowing downhill. The bard considered all the performances of his life, the weddings, the harvest feasts, the lonely evenings when a single widow had smiled because an old melody reminded her of happier days. Perhaps generosity echoed farther than anyone realized. The fountain seemed to believe so. Morning arrived gradually. The valley awakened without hurry. Mist drifted lazily above the grass before dissolving beneath the first rays of sunlight. Flowers opened, butterflies returned. At last, birds began singing. Not many, only a few, yet their voices filled the hidden valley with a warmth that had been quietly absent before. Aldrin listened with genuine delight. They're beautiful. They always were. The stranger smiled. You simply hear them differently now. After sharing a modest breakfast of bread, dried fruit, and fresh spring water, not from the fountain this time, but from a small stream nearby, they wandered together through the valley. Aldrin noticed details he had overlooked before. Tiny blue flowers growing between ancient stones, mushrooms shaped almost like little umbrellas beneath fallen logs, a fox watching them. Briefly from the edge of the trees before disappearing without sound. Nothing extraordinary. Everything extraordinary. It depended entirely upon where one placed attention. Near the western side of the valley stood an old apple tree, its trunk twisted gracefully with age. Despite growing alone among the wildflowers, it bore ripe fruit. The stranger picked one and handed it to Aldrin. He took a bite. Sweet, crisp, perfect. I've had better, he announced with theatrical seriousness. The stranger stared at him. After several moments they asked, Have you? Aldrin grinned. No, I suspected not. For one glorious moment, I hoped to impress you. You nearly did. Nearly. You committed too completely. They both laughed. The sound echoed pleasantly among the cliffs. It felt good, natural, as though laughter itself belonged here. As they continued walking, Aldrin began noticing something unusual about the valley's edges. The flowers grew thickest near the fountain. Farther away they became fewer. The grass grew taller, the trees denser. Eventually the landscape blended naturally into untouched woodland. No walls separated enchantment from ordinary forest. Only gradual change, like dawn becoming morning. The bard knelt beside a patch of tiny white blossoms. I thought the magic would end abruptly. The world rarely changes all at once. The stranger rested their staff upon the ground. It prefers quiet transitions. That observation reminded Aldrin of music. The finest melodies rarely leaped wildly between notes. They flowed, each moment preparing the next. Toward midday, they reached a narrow footpath leading away from the valley. Unlike the trail Aldrin had followed into the forest, this one seemed almost forgotten. Grass grew across it. Wildflowers leaned gently over its edges. Where does this go? He asked. A village. I thought there wasn't one nearby. There wasn't. The answer puzzled him. The stranger continued. There is now. They began walking. Aldrin followed. The path wound through peaceful woodland before emerging into rolling meadows bathed in warm sunlight. After perhaps an hour, the sound of distant voices reached them. Children laughing, dogs barking, someone chopping wood. Soon a small village appeared. Its cottages clustered around a modest stone well. Smoke drifted lazily from chimneys. Gardens overflowed with vegetables and herbs. Everything looked wonderfully ordinary. Yet something felt different. The villagers greeted one another warmly. Neighbors paused naturally to help carry baskets or repair fences. No one seemed hurried. No one raised their voice. An old woman sat spinning wool while quietly singing. The melody caught Aldrin's attention immediately. It was one he had heard in the fountain, only simpler, gentler, as though generations had polished away its oldest flourishes. He approached politely. "That's a lovely song," the woman smiled. "My grandmother taught it to me." "And her grandmother?" "I expect so." "What is it called?" She thought for a long moment. "I don't believe it has a name." Aldrin felt a curious shiver. The song had survived. Its history had not. A blacksmith nearby whistled another familiar melody while shaping horseshoes. Children skipping rope sang a tune that echoed faintly from one of the visions within the fountain. Everywhere Aldrin listened, fragments appeared, like scattered pieces of a magnificent tapestry still quietly woven into ordinary life. The stranger watched him, noticing. "They don't know. They've forgotten where the songs came from. They remember enough." An elderly shepherd invited them to share fresh cheese and warm bread beneath the shade of a walnut tree. Conversation flowed easily. The villagers spoke of weather, harvests, wandering traders, stubborn goats, and one particularly determined, Rooster, who apparently believed sunrise occasionally required assistance at midnight. "The rooster keeps dreadful hours," the shepherd complained. "Very inconsiderate." His wife chuckled. "He has the confidence of a king. The judgment of a cabbage." Aldrin nearly laughed hard enough to spill his cider. Some personalities, he reflected, existed in every century. While they ate, Aldrin quietly observed the people around him. Their songs survived. Their kindness survived. Their customs survived. Yet none spoke of hidden valleys or enchanted fountains. It was as though the source had gently disappeared, while its gifts continued flowing outward through generations. There is an old marginal tale preserved in a handful of medieval manuscripts describing villages that forgot miracles but remembered gratitude. Scholars have long debated whether the story was symbolic or historical, but its lesson remained simple. Blessings often endure longest after their origins are forgotten. Watching the villagers, Aldrin understood. Perhaps that was exactly how the fountain wished to be remembered. Or perhaps not remembered at all. As afternoon shadows lengthened, he and the stranger quietly departed the village. No one questioned where they were going. No one asked their names. The unnamed melodies continued drifting through the warm summer air behind them. Aldrin looked back one final time. So the fountain never kept its gifts. The stranger smiled. It was never meant to. They turned toward the hidden valley once more. But now, for the first time since discovering the secret spring, Aldrin found himself wondering not what else the fountain might give, but what the ordinary world had already been carrying all along. The walk back to the hidden valley felt shorter than the journey away. Perhaps the path truly was easier in the afternoon light. Or perhaps Aldrin's thoughts had become so full that time simply found fewer empty places to settle. The songs from the village lingered gently in his memory. Not because they were perfect, quite the opposite. The blacksmith had missed several notes while whistling. The children had changed the rhythm whenever they grew excited. The old shepherd sang just a little behind the beat, yet every melody carried warmth, not polished, lived. He realized with some surprise that he preferred them that way. The stranger seemed to notice the quiet smile on his face. "You heard something." "I did." "What was it?" Aldrin thought for a moment. "Imperfection." The stranger nodded. "And?" "It made the songs better." They walked another few paces before the stranger spoke again. "The fountain remembers every version." That simple sentence settled comfortably in Aldrin's thoughts. Every version. Not merely the finest performance, Not the most skilled musician, not the cleanest voice. Every attempt, every hesitant beginning. Every child singing just a little too loudly because enthusiasm had arrived before technique. There was unexpected comfort in that. The valley welcomed them with the same quiet grace as before. The butterflies drifted lazily among the flowers. The ash trees swayed gently. The fountain continued its endless patient song. Nothing had changed, except perhaps Aldrin. He approached the water slowly. Its surface reflected the afternoon sky with astonishing clarity. The temptation to drink again arrived almost immediately, not as a command, not even as a desire, more like a suggestion whispered by curiosity itself. One more sip, there might be another song. He smiled faintly. There you are. The stranger glanced toward him. What? I wondered when that thought would appear. It always does. Aldrin crouched beside the basin. The water looked exactly as it had before. Cool, clear, inviting. He dipped his fingertips into the gentle stream flowing from the upper bowl, only enough to feel its coolness. Nothing more. The sensation spread through his hand with the same peaceful warmth as before. Almost instinctively, he lifted the damp fingers toward his lips. He stopped halfway. A tiny voice interrupted him. Not magical, entirely ordinary. A robin landed upon the fountain's edge. It tilted its head, studied Aldrin carefully. Then, with complete confidence, it drank from a shallow puddle beside the basin instead of from the fountain itself. When it finished, it fluttered to a nearby branch and began singing. A cheerful, uncomplicated, perfectly ordinary robin's song. Aldrin lowered his hand. The stranger smiled without saying anything. I think, Aldrin admitted, I've just been gently corrected by a bird. They're remarkably good at it. I've underestimated robins. Most people do. The bard laughed softly. The moment passed. The temptation faded. Not defeated, simply understood. He dried his hand upon his cloak and settled beneath the shade of an ash tree. For the first time since arriving, he chose not to sit beside the fountain itself. Instead, he listened from a distance. The music still reached him. Nothing had been lost. As the afternoon unfolded, Aldrin found himself remembering songs from his own childhood. Simple melodies. His mother had hummed while baking bread. Harvest tunes sung by farmers who cared little whether anyone considered them musical. A lullaby performed so softly by his grandmother that he had spent years wondering whether he had dreamed it. None of those melodies had appeared in the fountain, or perhaps they had always been there. He simply hadn't recognized them. The thought lingered pleasantly. Toward evening, the stranger approached carrying 2 small wooden cups, fresh water from the nearby stream, not the fountain. They handed one to Aldrin. He accepted it gratefully. This tastes wonderful. It does, he smiled. I notice you're very careful about where we collect drinking water. The stranger looked toward the fountain. There is a difference between appreciating a gift and depending upon it. Aldrin nodded slowly. The distinction felt important. They sat together in comfortable silence. A gentle breeze carried the scent of pine through the valley. High above, swallows wheeled gracefully across the open sky. One swooped unexpectedly low over Aldrin's head. He ducked instinctively. The bird missed him by an impressive margin. I believe, he announced with complete seriousness, that swallow is showing off. The stranger followed its graceful flight. It has young. So? They're watching. Aldrin blinked. Even birds perform for their children? Especially birds. He couldn't argue with that. It sounded entirely plausible. There exists a curious medieval belief, recorded in several rural chronicles, that swallows brought not only the spring, but also lessons in courage. Parents sometimes pointed to their fearless flight, encouraging children to be bold enough to leave home while wise enough to return. Watching the graceful birds circle overhead, Aldrin found the old tradition unexpectedly charming. As sunset painted the valley in warm amber light, something unusual happened. The fountain's ripples changed. Instead of spreading outward, they began moving inward. Every tiny circle traveled gently toward the center of the basin. Aldrin noticed immediately. "So that's new." The stranger stood. "Yes." "What does it mean?" "They're arriving." Before Aldrin could ask who, faint figures began appearing along the edge of the valley. Not solid, not transparent. Something between memory and moonlight. Men, women, children, old travelers, young musicians, farmers, sailors, mothers carrying infants. None spoke. None seemed aware of Aldrin. They simply walked peacefully toward the fountain. Each paused beside the water, smiled softly, then continued onward, not disappearing, simply fading into the evening air as though walking beyond the edge of sight itself. Aldrin watched in silent amazement. "The memories?" The stranger shook their head. "No." "The people?" "Not exactly." "Then who are they?" The answer came almost as quietly as the fountain itself. Those who were remembered. Aldrin felt a gentle shiver. One elderly woman paused beside the basin. She rested invisible fingers upon its stone. Although her face remained unfamiliar, the kindness within her smile felt instantly recognizable. A baker, perhaps, or someone's grandmother. A young shepherd followed. Then a fisherman. Then a child, holding what looked remarkably like a carved wooden flute. Each lingered only a heartbeat, then continued onward. No sadness accompanied the procession, no fear, only quiet gratitude. "They come every evening?" "No." "When?" "When someone remembers." Aldrin looked at the stranger. "I don't understand." "Today, somewhere in the world." The stranger watched another figure smile gently before fading. Someone told a story. Another memory appeared, or sang an old song. A little girl skipped happily past the fountain, or repeated a family tradition. An elderly man tipped an imaginary hat toward the water, or spoke a forgotten name with love. The meaning unfolded slowly. The fountain did not collect people. It collected remembrance. Every act of genuine memory echoed here, not because the fountain demanded it. Because memory naturally found its way home. Aldrin felt tears gathering once more. This time he did not wipe them away. He simply watched. The quiet procession continued until the last light faded from the valley. One final figure approached, a wandering bard. His cloak was patched, his boots were worn, his lute rested across his back. For one startling heartbeat, Aldrin thought he was looking at himself. Then the figure smiled. Different eyes, different face, another traveler. He touched the fountain lightly, nodded toward the present-day bard as though recognizing a fellow musician across centuries. Then he was gone. Night settled gently over the valley once more. The fountain returned to perfect stillness. Aldrin remained seated for a long time, understanding now that songs did more than entertain. Stories did more than pass time. Kindness did more than brighten difficult days. Everything freely shared continued traveling through the world, long after its giver had disappeared, and somewhere beyond sight, beside an ancient fountain hidden from every map, those quiet gifts were never truly forgotten. Dawn arrived wrapped in pale mist. The valley stirred slowly, as though it had learned long ago that there was no prize for greeting the morning in a hurry. Dew rested upon every blade of grass, each droplet catching the first light until the meadow seemed sprinkled with tiny pearls. Aldrin woke beneath the ash tree where he had slept. For a few peaceful moments, he simply watched the mist drift over the fountain. It looked exactly as it had on the day he arrived, unchanged, patient, endlessly flowing. He stretched, reached automatically for his lute, and played a single quiet chord. The valley answered with birdsong, not enchanted voices, just robins, wrens, and finches welcoming the new day. He smiled. Their music felt every bit as beautiful as the mysterious harmonies he had heard from the fountain, perhaps even more so. The stranger was already awake, seated beside the stream that flowed away from the hidden spring. They watched the water without appearing to expect anything from it. Aldrin joined them. "You rise early." "I stopped measuring mornings." "That sounds wonderfully peaceful. It also makes oversleeping impossible." The bard laughed. "There are disadvantages to wisdom after all." "There usually are." They shared a quiet breakfast. Fresh apples, bread, clear stream water. Nothing remarkable. Everything satisfying. When they had finished, the stranger stood. "There is something you have not yet seen." Aldrin brushed the crumbs from his cloak. "I suspected the valley wasn't finished surprising me." "It rarely is." They walked behind the fountain. Once more, passing the weathered remembrance stones and continuing beyond the narrow cavern they had visited the night before. The path grew steeper. The flowers gradually gave way to moss-covered rock. Soon they reached the base of the surrounding cliffs. At first, Aldrin saw nothing unusual. Then the stranger placed one hand upon a broad stone wall. A faint grinding sound echoed through the valley. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, part of the cliff shifted inward. A narrow passage opened, not magical, mechanical. Ancient craftsmanship, hidden so perfectly that the entrance vanished completely when closed. Aldrin stared. "I walked past this several times." "You weren't ready to notice it." "I feel that's becoming a theme." The stranger smiled. "It often is." They entered together. The passage descended gently beneath the valley. The air grew cooler. Small crystals embedded within the stone reflected shafts of sunlight filtering through cracks overhead, filling the corridor with a soft silver glow. Water dripped somewhere in the distance. The sound echoed rhythmically, almost like a slow heartbeat. Eventually, the tunnel widened into an enormous chamber. Aldrin stopped in astonishment. The cavern stretched farther than he could easily see. Massive stone pillars rose naturally from floor to ceiling, supporting arches carved by time rather than chisels. Clear pools reflected shimmering light across the walls and everywhere. There were carvings, far more than those in the smaller chamber, entire walls covered with them, spirals, constellations, rivers winding through mountains, musicians gathered around campfires, families planting orchards, children learning songs from gray-haired elders, travelers helping strangers across broken bridges, simple acts, patiently preserved. The stranger spoke quietly. This place came first. The fountain? No. The remembering. Aldrin stepped closer to one immense carving that stretched across an entire wall. It showed countless figures passing cups of water from one person to another. No one drank alone. The cups simply continued moving. What does it mean? The stranger rested their fingertips upon the ancient stone. Nothing worth keeping survives by being kept. Aldrin considered the words carefully. The carving suddenly became obvious. Water flowed, songs traveled, stories wandered, kindness spread. The moment someone tried to own them completely, they stopped living. He walked farther into the chamber. Near its center stood a circular platform carved directly from the living rock. Upon it rested no treasure, no throne, no relic wrapped in silk, only a single empty stone bowl, smaller than the fountain above, perfectly smooth. Aldrin approached. It's empty. It has always been empty. Why preserve it? The stranger looked at the bowl almost fondly, because people need reminders. Reminders of what? That not every vessel exists to be filled. The answer lingered in the cool air. Aldrin suddenly thought of musicians. Some filled every silence with notes. The finest knew when to leave space between melodies. Silence, too, had purpose. A curious note echoed through the cavern, not from the fountain, not from the stranger. Aldrin turned. The sound had come from deeper within the chamber. Another followed, then another. 3 quiet notes, separated by long pauses. He looked toward the stranger. They're waiting. For whom? You. Aldrin hesitated, then walked toward the sound. The passage narrowed once more before opening into a final chamber. This one was surprisingly small, round, perfectly symmetrical. Its ceiling rose into a graceful dome. At the center stood a stone pedestal supporting a collection of weathered clay tablets and carefully rolled parchments sealed inside glass vessels. His eyes widened. Music. The stranger nodded. Some. Aldrin knelt carefully. The nearest tablet contained musical notation unlike anything he had ever seen. Not because it was complicated. Because it was astonishingly familiar. Fragments of melodies from the fountain, pieces of songs. The villagers still hummed, the lullaby from his grandmother, the shepherd's tune, the invisible choir, all connected, not identical, growing, changing, living. He gently unrolled one parchment. The ink had faded, but careful handwriting remained visible. It described no magical spells, no rituals, only observations. A child altered the melody today. It became gentler. Another. A fisherman forgot the final verse. His daughter invented a better ending. Another. The harvest song crossed the mountains. Now it carries a different rhythm. Aldrin looked up slowly. They studied the songs. They followed them. They expected them to change. They hoped they would. The stranger smiled. A song that never changes eventually stops traveling. That thought delighted Aldrin. For years he had worried whenever audiences sang his melodies differently than he had written them. Now, perhaps they had been honoring them all along. There existed an unusual practice among certain medieval monasteries where scribes sometimes copied mistakes from older manuscripts into the new ones, believing that every generation quietly became part of the text. Modern scholars debate whether this happened often, but the idea itself reveals something beautiful. Preservation and change were not always considered enemies. Here beneath the valley, that philosophy seemed carved into stone itself. Aldrin spent hours examining the ancient records. None claimed ownership. No author demanded recognition. Every page celebrated continuation rather than perfection. Eventually, he found one final parchment. Unlike the others, it contained no music, only a single sentence. The finest songs disappear into other voices. He read it twice, then a third time. Something inside him shifted. He suddenly understood why the villagers had never known the names of their oldest melodies, why the fountain remembered generosity rather than fame, why the stranger had never introduced themselves properly. Names mattered, but they were not always the part that lasted. The melody lasted. The kindness lasted. The gift lasted. The giver eventually became another quiet thread woven into the tapestry. Aldrin rolled the parchment closed with extraordinary care. When he stood, he realized the chamber had grown darker. Afternoon light was already fading beyond the cracks high overhead. "So," the stranger asked gently, "what have you learned?" Aldrin looked around the silent room, at the empty bowl, the ancient carvings, the forgotten musicians whose work still echoed through ordinary villages. Finally, he answered, I came searching for songs. And? I think, he smiled softly. I've been finding reasons to let them go. The stranger's expression warmed with quiet approval. Far above them, the hidden fountain continued flowing beneath the evening sky, waiting patiently for the choice that every wandering soul eventually had to make. The evening air felt different after leaving the chambers beneath the valley. Not because the wind had changed, not because the flowers had bloomed differently. The change rested entirely within Aldrin. He climbed the last few steps from the hidden passage and paused beside the fountain once more. The familiar sound of falling water greeted him like an old friend. Only now, he heard something he had overlooked before. The fountain never hurried. Not one drop rushed to reach the basin below. Each stream followed its own quiet course, trusting that every moment would arrive exactly when it should. For someone who had spent years racing from village to village before the next festival ended, it was a surprisingly difficult lesson. The stranger stood nearby, watching the evening light settle across the valley. You've become quieter. I have. Does it trouble you? Aldrin considered the question. No, he smiled. It surprises me. The stranger nodded, as though surprise were often the first companion of understanding. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The valley no longer felt as though it demanded conversation. Silence had become another language. Eventually, Aldrin reached for his lute. I'd like to play. The stranger inclined their head. Then play. He settled beneath the ash tree, adjusted the familiar instrument across his lap, and closed his eyes. At first, he intended to perform one of the melodies the fountain had revealed. Instead, his fingers wandered somewhere entirely unexpected. The opening phrase belonged to an old harvest tune from his childhood. The second borrowed a rhythm from the blacksmith in the nearby village. A gentle flourish echoed the mysterious voices he had heard within the valley. Then came something entirely his own, or perhaps not entirely his. It no longer mattered. The melody flowed naturally from one idea to the next, without asking who deserved the credit. The fountain answered with soft ripples, not brighter than before, not more dramatic, simply content. When the final note faded, the stranger smiled. That one has begun its journey. Aldrin looked up. I only just finished writing it. No. The stranger's eyes reflected the quiet water. You finished carrying it. The words lingered. Finished carrying it, not owning it, not inventing it, carrying it. Like a traveler entrusted with a lantern through one small stretch of darkness before passing the light onward. The thought filled him with unexpected peace. As twilight deepened, Aldrin wandered through the valley alone. Not because he wished to be solitary, because his feet seemed drawn gently toward familiar places. The remembrance stones, the apple tree, the stream flowing away from the fountain. He paused beside each without urgency. Near the stream, he noticed a tiny footbridge he had somehow overlooked during previous walks. It crossed little more than a narrow ribbon of water, perfectly ordinary. The wooden planks creaked pleasantly beneath his weight. Halfway across, he stopped. Something floated downstream, a small wreath woven from willow branches. Fresh flowers rested among its leaves. No one stood nearby. The current carried it gently beneath the bridge and onward through the valley. Aldrin watched until it disappeared. When he returned to the stranger, curiosity finally overcame him. I saw a wreath in the stream. The stranger nodded. It happens sometimes. Who leaves them? Those who remember. The villagers? Occasionally. But they don't know about the fountain. They don't need to. The answer no longer puzzled Aldrin as much as it once would have. Gratitude often traveled roads invisible even to those walking them. There is an old medieval custom recorded in scattered parish accounts of floating small wreaths upon rivers during certain feast days. The flowers were not sent to specific people. They were offerings of thanks for safe journeys, good harvests, and loved ones remembered. Over time, many villages continued the tradition, long after forgetting exactly how it had begun. Watching the quiet stream, Aldrin wondered whether customs sometimes remembered what people could not. The moon rose slowly. Its reflection shimmered across the fountain. Without warning, Aldrin felt the familiar temptation return, not stronger, simply quieter, more persuasive. One more drink. Surely now you understand enough. Surely now it would be safe. He looked toward the water. The fountain remained unchanged. It neither called nor refused. It simply existed, patient, generous, silent. He realized then that the temptation had never come from the fountain. It came from himself, from the part of every traveler that believed one more mile would reveal the perfect view. One more story would answer every question. One more song would finally be enough. He laughed softly. There is no such thing as enough. Is there? The stranger glanced at him. There is. There is. It simply rarely arrives where people expect. Aldrin looked around the valley. The flowers, the trees, the flowing water, the ordinary stream beside it, the birds settling into evening nests. Perhaps enough had been here for quite some time. He simply hadn't recognized it. The stranger approached the fountain and rested both hands upon its ancient stone. There is something you should know. Aldrin waited. Tomorrow the valley will ask you a question. He smiled faintly. I thought it had been asking questions ever since I arrived. It has. This one is different. Yes. Will I know it? You already do. The answer settled gently into the night. Aldrin suspected arguing would accomplish very little. Instead, he sat once more beneath the ash tree. The stars emerged one by one. The familiar melodies drifted softly through his thoughts. Yet for the first time, he made no effort to remember every note. He trusted that the ones meant to stay would remain. The others would continue traveling, perhaps to another wandering musician. Perhaps to a child, humming while gathering apples. Perhaps to someone not yet born. That thought no longer saddened him. It comforted him. Before sleeping, he looked once more toward the fountain. The water glowed faintly beneath the moonlight. Beautiful, peaceful, unchanging. And somewhere deep within his heart, Aldrin understood that the greatest decision of his life was no longer approaching. It had already begun. The valley greeted the new morning with the quiet confidence of a place that had welcomed countless dawns before this one. Mist drifted lazily over the meadow before the first sunlight dissolved it into shimmering threads. The fountain continued its endless song, unchanged by the passing of another night. Aldrin woke before the birds. For a few moments, he remained where he was, watching the sky brighten above the ring of ash trees. The stranger's words returned immediately. Tomorrow the valley will ask you a question. No mysterious voice had spoken. No glowing letters had appeared across the sky. Everything looked wonderfully ordinary, which somehow made the anticipation even stronger. He rose, stretched, and walked toward the fountain. The water sparkled in the early light. Its surface was perfectly still. When he looked into it, he expected to see only his own reflection. Instead, he saw the road. Not the valley, not the cliffs. A dusty road winding through rolling hills beneath a bright summer sky. He blinked. The vision remained. Travelers crossed it. Merchants leading wagons. Pilgrims carrying walking staffs. Children running ahead of their parents. A shepherd guiding a small flock toward distant pasture. The scene felt so real that he almost expected to hear the creak of wagon wheels. Then the water settled. His reflection returned. The stranger approached quietly. "What did you see?" "A road." They nodded. "What did you feel?" Aldrin thought carefully. "Movement." "And?" He smiled faintly. "Curiosity." The stranger rested one hand upon the fountain. "Good. That was the question?" "No." Aldrin sighed dramatically. "You do enjoy mysterious answers." "I've had centuries of practice." That was difficult to argue with. After breakfast, they wandered through the valley together, one final time. Or at least, Aldrin suspected it might be the final time. He no longer tried to memorize every flower or every stone. Instead, he simply noticed them. The old apple tree stood quietly beneath the morning sun. The stream laughed softly over smooth rocks. A family of rabbits darted through tall grass before disappearing into their burrow. Life continued exactly as it should. Near the remembrance stones, Aldrin paused. The blank marker still waited among the others, untouched. He rested his hand gently upon its smooth surface. "It doesn't belong to me." The stranger smiled. "No. I wondered. Most people do." The bard laughed softly. "I suppose vanity travels surprisingly well." "It does. But so does humility." He looked once more at the empty stone. For reasons he couldn't entirely explain, he was glad it remained blank. Not every story required carving into rock. Some belonged upon roads. They continued toward the fountain. As they walked, Aldrin became aware of something unusual. The songs within his mind had changed. The mysterious melodies were still there. So were the village tunes, the lullabies, the harvest songs. But none stood apart anymore. They blended naturally, like old friends who had stopped introducing themselves years ago. He picked up his lute. Without thinking, he began playing. The melody flowed effortlessly, not because it was perfect, because he no longer worried about making it so. The fountain answered with gentle ripples. The birds continued singing. Neither attempted to outshine the other. They simply belonged together. When the music faded, the valley fell peacefully silent. Then the stranger finally spoke. "It is time." Aldrin looked toward them. "For the question? For your answer." He frowned. "But no one has asked anything." The stranger stepped aside, gesturing toward the fountain, toward the narrow path leading back into the forest, toward the open sky above the valley. Nothing more. Slowly, very slowly, understanding arrived. The question had never required words. Stay or leave. That was all. The valley would welcome either choice. The fountain would continue flowing regardless. No judgment, no punishment, only decision. Aldrin stood quietly. His eyes drifted toward the water. One more drink, one more song, one more day. The possibilities stretched endlessly before him. Then he remembered the villagers, the children singing forgotten melodies, the blacksmith whistling while he worked, the shepherd smiling beneath the walnut tree, the road reflected in the fountain, movement, continuation. He looked down at his lute. Its wood bore scratches, gathered from years of travel. The corners were worn smooth where countless hands had lifted it. It wasn't meant to rest forever in one beautiful valley. Neither, perhaps, was he. A gentle breeze crossed the meadow. The rosemary sprig still tucked inside his cloak released its familiar fragrance. Remembrance, gratitude, journey, everything quietly pointed in the same direction. There is an old medieval saying, preserved in several collections of pilgrims' tales, that roads are happiest beneath traveling feet. Whether anyone truly believed the roads themselves possessed feelings hardly mattered. The proverb reminded travelers that wisdom gathered along the way fulfilled its purpose only when carried onward. Aldrin smiled. He understood now. The fountain had never intended to keep musicians. It had always needed messengers. He turned toward the stranger. "I think," They waited patiently. It's time. A quiet warmth spread across the stranger's face. I know. You knew all along. I hoped. Aldrin looked once more at the fountain. No sadness touched him, only gratitude. He walked slowly to the basin, rested one hand upon its cool stone. Thank you. The water shimmered gently. Nothing more. It required nothing more. He lifted his hand, turned, and began walking toward the forest path. After only a few steps, he paused. One last glance. The fountain glowed peacefully beneath the afternoon sun, exactly as it had when he first discovered it, exactly as it would long after he was gone. The stranger remained beside it, calm, patient, watching without waving farewell. Perhaps because true farewells were unnecessary between places and people who remembered one another. Aldrin smiled, then continued walking. The valley did not call him back. It did not tempt him. It simply allowed him to leave. Somewhere behind him, the fountain continued singing. Somewhere ahead, unfamiliar roads waited beneath open skies. And with every step carrying him farther from the hidden spring, Aldrin discovered something quietly remarkable. The music had not stayed behind. It walked beside him. The forest welcomed Aldrin differently than it had before. When he had first entered beneath its ancient branches, every silence had felt mysterious, every shadow filled with questions. Now, as he followed the winding path away from the hidden valley, the woods seemed less like a puzzle and more like an old companion walking beside him. Birds sang freely overhead. A woodpecker tapped patiently against an oak somewhere in the distance. Leaves whispered softly whenever the breeze wandered through their branches. None of those sounds had changed. Only his listening had. He walked without hurry. The familiar trail that had once twisted confusingly between roots and moss now unfolded naturally before him. The weathered milestone still leaned at its impossible angle. It continued insisting that north was somewhere delightfully unhelpful. Aldrin chuckled. I hope you're enjoying yourself. The stone, displaying admirable commitment to mystery, offered no reply. He bowed politely anyway. It seemed the proper thing to do. A little farther on, he reached the tiny bridge where he had first found the white feather. This time, another feather rested upon the center plank. Not white, a warm brown, edged with delicate golden markings. He picked it up gently. It was cool to the touch, perfectly ordinary. He tucked it carefully into the strap of his lute, not as a magical charm, simply as a reminder that even the smallest discoveries deserved appreciation. As he crossed the bridge, the stream laughed quietly beneath the wooden planks. The sound reminded him of the fountain, not because they were identical, because they were wonderfully different. One preserved, the other wandered. Both belonged exactly where they were. By midday, sunlight streamed more brightly through the thinning trees. The forest no longer felt endless. Its edge waited somewhere ahead. Before reaching it, however, Aldrin noticed movement among the ferns. The exceptionally sleepy tortoise from earlier slowly emerged from beneath a moss-covered log. It regarded him with profound seriousness. Or perhaps that was simply the natural expression of tortoises. Difficult journey? Aldrin asked. The tortoise blinked once. He nodded thoughtfully. I understand. The tortoise continued staring. I've changed a little. Another blink. I suppose you probably knew that already. Without the slightest hint of urgency, the tortoise resumed its steady walk into the undergrowth. Aldrin laughed. There are conversations no one would believe. He continued toward the forest's edge. When the first meadow finally appeared between the trees, he paused. Behind him lay the hidden valley. Ahead stretched familiar roads leading toward villages, markets, festivals, and ordinary life. He inhaled deeply. The scent of wildflowers drifted across the open fields. For a brief moment, he considered turning back, not because he regretted leaving, simply because beautiful places naturally invited one last look. He smiled, then kept walking. By late afternoon, he reached the same village where his journey had begun. Children were chasing each other through the square. The blacksmith's hammer rang rhythmically. The baker's ovens filled the air with the comforting aroma of fresh bread. Life had continued while he was away, just as it should. The old woman who had tucked Rosemary into his cloak noticed him almost immediately. "There you are. I was beginning to wonder if the hills had adopted you." They considered it. "And they decided I required too many meals." She laughed warmly. "I suspected as much." She noticed the rosemary still resting safely inside his cloak. "You kept it." "I did." "Good." Neither of them mentioned why. Perhaps neither needed to. The baker insisted Aldrin accept a warm loaf before he had even unpacked his loot. The shepherd offered fresh cheese. Someone else pressed a handful of ripe pears into his hands. Within minutes, he had acquired enough food to suggest the village believed wandering musicians became dramatically underfed whenever they disappeared for more than a day. It was a comforting misunderstanding. As evening approached, familiar faces gathered beneath the old oak tree where he had first performed. "Play something new," one child shouted. Another quickly added, "But also something old." Aldrin laughed. "That is a surprisingly difficult request." "It is? Very." The children considered this carefully. Then one shrugged. "You'll think of something." Such extraordinary confidence. He wished he possessed half as much. Aldrin settled beneath the oak. The villagers gathered naturally around him. No grand stage, no noble audience. Only ordinary people, ending another ordinary day together. He adjusted the strings of his lute. For a long moment, he remained still. Then he began, the opening. Melody was gentle, unfamiliar, yet somehow comforting. Fragments of ancient harmonies drifted quietly through it. The rhythm carried echoes of farmers working beneath summer skies. A shepherd's whistle appeared briefly before giving way to a lively dance tune. Children immediately began clapping along. The blacksmith started humming. The baker smiled without realizing he was singing the refrain before Aldrin himself reached it. The melody had already begun traveling. Halfway through the performance, Aldrin deliberately changed one phrase. The children copied him. The blacksmith added another variation. Someone in the back sang an entirely different harmony. Instead of correcting them, Aldrin laughed. The song became richer, messier, alive. That, he realized, was exactly as it should be. There is a delightful medieval tradition mentioned in several accounts of traveling minstrels. That village audiences often improved songs simply by refusing to sing them the same way twice. Professional musicians occasionally complained about this habit, but the songs themselves usually benefited from such enthusiastic collaboration. Watching the villagers joyfully reshape his newest melody, Aldrin suspected those old audiences had understood something important. When the final note faded, applause filled the square, not thunderous, warm, grateful. One little girl tugged gently at his sleeve. "What is the song called?" Aldrin opened his mouth, then paused. He had never named it. Perhaps it didn't need one. He smiled. "I don't know yet." The little girl nodded, as though that made perfect sense. "I'll call it the walking song." "Why?" "Because it feels like it keeps going." She skipped happily back to her parents before he could ask another question. The walking song. Aldrin liked that. Perhaps she had named it better than he ever could. As darkness settled over the village, people slowly drifted home. Yet several continued humming the melody as they disappeared into quiet streets. Aldrin listened until the last voice faded into the night. The stranger had been right. The finest songs disappeared into other voices, and somehow that felt better than applause. As he looked toward the distant northern hills, barely visible beneath the evening stars, he whispered a quiet thank you to the hidden valley. The fountain did not answer. It didn't have to. Somewhere beyond those dark forests, it continued flowing exactly as before, patiently waiting, not for someone who wished to keep its gifts, but for the next traveler willing to carry them onward. Summer gradually surrendered to autumn. The change arrived so gently that Aldrin scarcely noticed it at first. Green leaves gathered hints of gold around their edges. Morning air carried a pleasant coolness. Farmers spoke less about planting and more about harvest wagons, full granaries, and whether this year's apples deserved more praise than last year's. According to every village elder, they certainly did. Every single year. Aldrin smiled whenever those familiar debates began. Some traditions required no improvement. He continued wandering from village to village, just as he always had. Yet something subtle had changed. He no longer traveled in search of remarkable stories. Instead, he found remarkable stories quietly waiting inside ordinary days. A widow teaching her grandson an old lullaby. A potter humming while shaping clay. Two brothers repairing a fence while arguing, good-naturedly, if rather loudly, about whose turn it was to chase the neighbor's remarkably determined goat. The goat, Aldrin privately concluded, had won the argument before it even began. He carried these moments with him as carefully as any melody. Soon, the walking song had wandered farther than he ever expected. In one village, children sang it while skipping along the riverbank. In another, mill workers whistled its tune while turning the great water wheel. A shepherd had slowed it into a gentle evening melody for calming restless sheep. The sheep seemed politely unimpressed, but the shepherd enjoyed it enormously. That counted for something. Each version differed. Each belonged completely to the people singing it. Aldrin never corrected them. Instead, he listened. Sometimes he borrowed their changes for his next performance. The song no longer felt like his. That realization brought him quiet happiness. One crisp autumn afternoon, he arrived at a bustling harvest fair. Bright banners fluttered between wooden stalls. Fresh bread filled the air with comforting warmth. Barrels of cider lined the marketplace. Children darted excitedly between storytellers, jugglers, and musicians. Aldrin found a place beneath an enormous chestnut tree. Before he even tuned his lute, someone nearby exclaimed, "You're the bard who knows the walking song." He blinked. "I am?" An elderly cooper laughed. "Everyone knows that. I've only been away a few months. Songs travel faster than wagons." They certainly did. By sunset, a cheerful crowd had gathered. Aldrin began with familiar tunes. The audience sang confidently, sometimes correctly, mostly enthusiastically. Halfway through the performance, he quietly shifted into the walking song. Immediately, voices joined him. Not one version, many. The melody blossomed into something entirely new. One group sang a higher harmony. Children invented playful echoes. Someone added hand claps. A fiddler he'd never met stepped forward without asking permission and somehow found exactly the right accompaniment. The entire marketplace seemed to breathe together. Aldrin stopped playing. No one noticed. The song continued without him. He rested both hands upon his lute and simply listened. The music no longer required its first traveler. It had found countless others. When the final chorus faded, applause erupted. A young musician approached him afterward. She carried a small harp polished smooth from years of careful practice. "I hope you don't mind." She looked slightly nervous. "I changed the third verse." Aldrin smiled warmly. I was hoping someone would. Her relief was immediate. I thought perhaps you'd be upset. Why would I? It's your song. He shook his head gently. It walks now. She tilted her head. I don't understand. You will. She smiled politely, perhaps assuming wandering bards occasionally answered perfectly ordinary questions with wonderfully confusing wisdom. To be fair, they often did. That evening, after the festival had quieted, Aldrin wandered to the edge of the nearby fields. Harvest stubble stretched across the landscape beneath a sky overflowing with stars. He sat upon an old stone wall and watched the moon rise. For the first time since leaving the hidden valley, he found himself wondering about the stranger. Were they still standing beside the fountain? Had another traveler arrived? Did the remembrance stones gain another inscription? Or did they simply continue waiting with the same patient calm they had always possessed? The questions felt comforting rather than urgent. Some mysteries deserved room to breathe. There is an old medieval belief, found in collections of travelers' sayings, that the finest guides never accompany you for the entire journey. Instead, they walk beside you only until you remember how to recognize the road for yourself. Aldrin suspected there was great wisdom in that thought. Winter arrived gently. Snow dusted rooftops. Rivers wore delicate collars of ice along their edges. Villages welcomed wandering musicians with even greater enthusiasm than usual. After all, stories seemed warmer when shared beside crackling fires. One snowy evening, Aldrin found himself performing inside a great manor hall. Lords and ladies listened politely. Servants paused discreetly near the doors. Even the household hounds stretched contentedly beside the hearth. The noble host requested something rare. Play us a song no one has heard. Aldrin thought for a moment, then smiled. I don't think I can. The lord looked puzzled. Surely a bard keeps secret melodies. I used to. And now? Now I prefer songs that don't stay secret. The hall fell pleasantly quiet. Then Aldrin began playing, not one mysterious masterpiece. Instead, he wove together. Melodies gathered from countless ordinary people, the widow's lullaby, the shepherd's whistle, the fiddler's lively harmony, the children's skipping rhythm, the blacksmith's cheerful mistakes, the harvest chorus. Every borrowed gift found its place. When he finished, the Lord stood slowly. I've never heard that before. Aldrin smiled. Yes, you have. The nobleman frowned. I have? In pieces. The Lord considered this carefully. Then, quite unexpectedly, laughed. I believe you're right. Later that night, one of the kitchen servants quietly approached while Aldrin packed his lute. My grandmother sang part of that melody. I thought I recognized it. She never knew where it came from. Aldrin looked toward the snow-covered courtyard beyond the open doorway. Neither did he. Not really. And perhaps that was the greatest gift the fountain had given him. Not knowledge, trust. Trust that beautiful things did not become less valuable simply because no one remembered who had first carried them into the world. As the servant walked away, humming the familiar tune, Aldrin listened with quiet gratitude. The melody sounded different again. Warmer, fuller, still walking, always walking, just as it was meant to. Years passed with the gentle certainty of rivers finding the sea. Seasons circled faithfully through blossom, harvest, frost, and spring again. Roads changed beneath countless footsteps. Children became parents. Saplings grew into sturdy trees. Villages expanded, rebuilt old bridges, celebrated weddings, mourned losses, and welcomed each sunrise with the quiet determination that has always carried ordinary people through extraordinary times. Aldrin kept traveling, not because he was searching anymore, because the road itself had become a conversation. Every village offered another verse. Every traveler carried another story. Every shared meal added another note to the endless song he had first begun hearing beside the hidden fountain. His patched cloak acquired new stitches. His boots required repairs so often that one cobbler joked they now contained more leather from his workshop than from the original pair. Aldrin examined them thoughtfully. "I suppose that means we've both contributed." The cobbler laughed. "I'll expect my share of the applause." "You may have all of it." Years earlier, Aldrin might have been joking. Now he meant every word. The walking song continued its remarkable journey. No two villages sang it the same way. In mountain settlements, it became slower and echoed proudly across the valleys. Along the coast, fishermen transformed it into a steady rowing rhythm. Monasteries softened it into peaceful hymns. Children turned parts of it into games. Mothers borrowed its gentlest phrases for lullabies. Traveling merchants hummed it without realizing they had carried it hundreds of miles from the place where they first heard it. Occasionally, someone asked Aldrin if he had written it. He always answered the same way. "I helped it along." Most people smiled politely, assuming he was simply being humble. Only a few truly understood. One spring afternoon, many years after discovering the hidden valley, Aldrin found himself resting beneath an old willow beside a familiar road. A young musician approached carrying a brand new lute that still smelled faintly of fresh wood. "Are you Master Aldrin?" The title made him laugh. "I've certainly been called worse." The young bard sat beside him. "I've been trying to collect every version of the walking song." "An impossible task." "I know." "Good." The young traveler looked slightly disappointed. "I hoped you might teach me the original." Aldrin remained quiet for a long moment. Finally, he lifted his lute. "I can teach you the first version I heard." He began to play, simple, gentle. The melody flowed through the warm afternoon air, exactly as he remembered it. When he finished, the younger bard frowned. "That's different." "So I've been told." "I learned another ending." "I'm glad." "My teacher added a bridge." "Excellent." "My grandmother sang a verse you didn't." Aldrin smiled broadly. "Even better." The young musician blinked. "You aren't upset?" "My friend." Aldrin looked toward the road stretching into the distance. If every traveler carried the same map forever, no one would discover new paths. Together, they spent the afternoon exchanging melodies. Neither corrected the other. Both left richer than they had arrived. Before departing, the younger bard hesitated. "There's one more thing." "Go on." "I heard an old story." "Oh?" "About a secret fountain hidden somewhere beyond the northern hills." Aldrin felt a familiar warmth spread through his heart. What did the story say? "That whoever drinks from it learns the greatest songs ever sung." He looked toward the distant horizon, then slowly shook his head. "Not quite." The younger musician leaned forward eagerly. "What really happens?" Aldrin smiled. "You learn how to listen." The young bard considered the answer. It clearly wasn't the dramatic tale he had expected. Still, he thanked Aldrin sincerely before continuing down the road. The older bard watched until the traveler disappeared beyond the next hill. He never mentioned the hidden valley. Some places revealed themselves only when they chose. There exists an old medieval proverb that claims wisdom cannot be handed from one person to another like a loaf of bread. At best, one traveler points toward the road. The walking must always be done by someone else. Aldrin thought the proverb wonderfully accurate. Late that summer, curiosity finally carried him back toward the northern hills. Not because he wished to drink again, simply because gratitude sometimes enjoys revisiting old friends. The forest welcomed him with birdsong. The impossible milestone still insisted upon its delightfully confusing directions. The little bridge remained sturdy. Even the sleepy tortoise occupied nearly the same patch of moss. Some habits, Aldrin reflected, deserved admiration. At last, he reached the hidden valley. It looked exactly as he remembered. The flowers, the ash trees, the quiet stream, the ancient fountain singing softly beneath the afternoon sun. The stranger stood beside it, neither older nor younger, simply present. "You came back. I said thank you once. You wished to say it again." "I did." They stood together without speaking for several peaceful moments. Finally, Aldrin noticed the remembrance stones. There was still one blank marker, the same one. He smiled. "I suppose I was wrong." The stranger looked toward it. "It was never waiting for you." "I know. Does that disappoint you?" Aldrin laughed softly. "Not anymore." The stranger's eyes shone warmly. "You have learned." "I've been learning. That is better." Aldrin rested one hand upon the fountain's cool stone. He felt no temptation to drink, no longing to remain, only quiet gratitude. The water flowed exactly as it always had, patient, generous, free. He bowed his head. "Take good care of the next traveler." The stranger smiled. "The valley will." With that, Aldrin turned toward the forest path once more. He did not look back. Some endings became stronger when carried forward, instead of watched from behind. The road welcomed him. Birds filled the trees with cheerful music. Somewhere ahead, another village waited. Another story. Another child ready to change a melody. Another ordinary kindness, destined to travel farther than anyone could imagine. And somewhere, hidden beyond every map, an ancient fountain continued remembering every song that had ever been shared with an open heart. As the years passed beyond counting, people gradually forgot Aldrin's name. They remembered the walking song. They remembered a cheerful wandering bard who laughed easily, accepted every changed verse with delight, and always seemed to know one more story than yesterday. For Aldrin, that was more than enough. The night grows softer now, and the road becomes quiet beneath a sky scattered with gentle stars. Somewhere far away, the hidden fountain continues its endless song, asking nothing, demanding nothing, simply offering its patient reminder that the finest gifts are those allowed to keep moving. Perhaps a breeze carries a forgotten melody across sleeping fields. Perhaps a shepherd hums an old tune while watching peaceful sheep beneath the moon. Perhaps a child dreams of roads not yet walked, of forests filled with birdsong, and of stories waiting kindly around the next bend. You need not remember every detail of Aldrin's journey. Like the fountain itself, the important things have a way of staying without being forced. A kind word shared freely. A quiet song passed from one voice to another. A grateful heart that knows when to linger and when to continue walking. The hills rest beneath their blanket of moonlight. The ancient trees whisper softly to one another. The stream keeps flowing, never rushing, never stopping. And somewhere beyond the reach of maps, where flowers bloom in peaceful silence and clear water sings through worn stone, the valley waits with endless patience for whoever may someday arrive with open ears, gentle curiosity, and a willingness to listen before speaking. May your own evening be just as peaceful. May your thoughts drift as gently as leaves upon quiet water. And may every pleasant story you've gathered today settle softly beside you, like old friends keeping watch until morning light returns.